All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Cliff Smith with the Middle East Forum. I'm the Washington Project Director, and today we have a somewhat unusual webinar that I think you'll find very enlightening. A while back, the Middle East Forum came into a recipient of documents detailing almost 46,000 grants, totaling over $770 million made by a charitable organization controlled and run by the Qatari regime called the Sheikh Eid bin Mohammed Al Thani Charitable Association, otherwise known as the Eid Charity. And these grants went to, among other things, radical Islamic organizations all around the world. Investigators from the Middle East Forum, as well as some of our friends and partners, have been researching these grants and the organizations that they funded for months. Just recently, they published a series of op-eds detailing a number of these grants and where they went to. And they've been writing articles about their findings in the last few weeks and where they went. And today, joining me is three of those people that have studied these grants, studied the organizations they went to, and tried to come to understand what is happening with Qatar and with the organizations they are funding. Specifically, joining me today is Martha Lee of the Middle East Forum's Islamist Watch Project, Abhinav Pandya of the Usanas Foundation, based in India, and Jordan Cope of the Director of Policy Education with Stand With Us, and the Qatari Finance Fellow at the Middle East Forum. Anyhow, I'm going to ask you guys a series of questions. Some will be directed to you guys generally, otherwise will be directed to you guys specifically, but you can answer as you see fit. But let's start with the very basics. What is the Eid charity and what is this relationship to the Qatari royal family? Anybody that wants to answer that? Yeah, go ahead and start. Martha, why don't you give it a shot?
Yes. So Eid charity has been described by the government as a semi-governmental organization. So I think it's quite evident that they have ties to the regime. They've also participated in a number of events where their strategy and policies were said to be organized along with the Qatari government. So I think there's really little doubt that they seem to be working hand in hand, and that Eid's projects are certainly not independent from Qatari policies.
Mm-hmm. And what exactly do they do on a day-to-day basis as an organization?
So it seems that their main activity is to distribute the grants that we'll be speaking about today. So they're active throughout the world and many different countries.
And do you believe all of these are to promote the regime's policies, or is it just general, some do and some don't? I mean, how do you view their MO?
Well, for example, I wouldn't say necessarily that every single organization they've given to is Islamist. I don't think we can say that for sure. But I think that just the fact that so many of the organizations that have received grants from Eid are tied to either lawful Islamist or even Islamist terrorist organization does indicate a clear pattern of support for extremism.
Certainly. Jordan, your recent article focuses mostly on recipients actually in the Middle East, and it noted in one section, and I quote, the Al Ihsan Charitable Society, a recipient of nearly 17.8 million, and a terrorist organization designated by Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain for their connections to Al-Qaeda. And I was wondering, this is obviously a pretty striking and overt act of funding a terrorist organization. How typical of that is the funds distributed by the Eid charity in the Middle East, based on what you've seen?
So, Cliff, I actually had two articles on the subject, and I happened to do some translation work. So I got to see the documents firsthand and to see the organizations they were going to. And funding for terrorist organizations is nothing that was so discreet. It obviously mentioned the name of the organizations that received such funding, such as the Al Ihsan, which received approximately $17 million and is reported to be headed by a former member of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula's Hazrami Council. His name is Abdullah al-Yazimi. And so there are a bunch of other charities affiliated with Al-Ihsan, such as the Rahma Charity Foundation, which is also designated by the quartet. Other concerning organizations included the Al-Hikmah Al-Yemeniya, which received approximately $6.5 million. And upon further research, it was discovered that they helped smuggle fighters into Iraq and were also reported to have provided material support for Al-Qaeda leaders in Yemen and Saudi Arabia. And these weren't the only organizations that warranted calls of attention. Many Hamas affiliates also received money. IHH, a Islamist organization from Turkey that is designated as a terrorist organization in certain parts of the world, received a whopping $23.2 million. And so it becomes evident throughout the receipts that I helped translate that Qatar has helped disguise its funding for Islamist and terrorist organizations as humanitarian relief.
Yeah. So in other words, you see that one particular sort of striking thing that I mentioned is not unique. You've seen many such things in similar ways.
It's certainly not unique. In regards to Hamas affiliates, I identified approximately six just straight off the bat that happen to have ties with Hamas. One organization, for instance, even happened to invite Ismail Haniya, the head of the political bureau of Hamas, to their events. Other organizations included Jamia al-Mujama'a al-Islami, whose Khan Yunis branch in Gaza actually shares the exact same name of the organization, al-Mujama'a al-Islami, that was actually founded by the founder of Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. And so you see a lot of these organizations. The Islamic Charitable Society of Hebron received about $5 million and is reported to have been a part of Hamas's Dawah network between 2000 and 2004. The Jerusalem International Foundation, another notorious organization designated by the United States, received about $3.7 million. The Ibn Baz Charitable Society, the society's president has previously expressed a will for closer cooperation with Hamas. And the Al-Nusra Charitable Society, which has ties to the Ibn Baz Society, which, as I aforementioned, has expressed a will to get closer with Hamas. And so you see these trends recurring time and time again. And I think one of the most shocking discoveries was, and it wasn't necessarily something new, but the receipts inspired an investigation into the Qatar Committee for the Reconstruction of Gaza giving all this funding, where we discovered $3 million donated, despite the org having received many, many millions of dollars in the past. And what we saw was something striking, and that was posts that have since been taken down from the Facebook page of the organization, but pictures ultimately depicting the head of the Qatar Committee for the Reconstruction of Gaza, a state charity, Ambassador Mohammed El-Ahmadi, meeting members of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad who have no real humanitarian efforts, and they refuse to engage in the political process. So this excuse of Qatar using charity and relations with Hamas and other terrorist organizations as a means of serving as an intermediary in the region simply is not true. The funding, to a large degree, as well as their political ideologies, endorse Islamist ideologies and terrorist organizations. And I think we learned that a lot through the receipts.
Got it. Abhinav, it is no secret that Qatar is increasingly aligned with Pakistan and thus de facto in opposition to India's interests. So perhaps it comes as no great surprise that, as you put in your article, over 1,200 transactions made to India, either directly under the name of each charity or through individual contributions, a total of 28.49 million, that is 7.82 million in US dollars, was transferred to 8 Salafi-based Islamist organizations in India. With Wahhabism being the version of Salafism being the national creed of Qatar. Can you explain a little what you found in these grants and how you think it helps the Qatari regime's goals?
Thank you so much, Cliff, for inviting me today. In fact, I must say that this is a very, very critical national security issue for India. And as I found in these 1,200 transactions, that this has been going on since 2008. But unfortunately, the case in India is a little complicated and a little more convoluted and mysterious, I must say, because the state intelligence agencies in Kerala and some of the national level intelligence agencies, they were flagging the, I would say the infiltration of the foreign money and to some organizations like PFI for the last 3 decades. But due to some political reasons and because it suited some of the political actors, the issue was never taken seriously. Then in 2012, there was one news website, not very prominent. They also revealed a set of documents, which brought forth these transactions. But most importantly, in the each charity, this, the recent investigation which I did, I came across this data. I mean, this was the most, I would say, detailed expose on how they were funneling money. And the interesting part is that it was the 1,200 transactions were there, and they came to the 8 groups basically. And most interestingly, let me just yes. So there's a long list. Okay, the largest transaction came to Salafi Philanthropic Society. It's a Kerala-based group, and the total number of transactions was 769, and in figures it was $4.9 million. Now it must be brought to highlight that Kerala is the state which sent the highest number of foreign fighters to ISIS from India. And Kerala has been witnessing a very strong onslaught of Wahhabi extremist influence over the last 2 to 3 decades, because there's this huge population of expatriates, the Kerala people working in the Middle Eastern countries, in the Gulf countries, and they come under these, especially the Middle Eastern Wahhabi or extremist influences. And certainly, I mean, because of those linkages, they are able to better exploit what this each charity funnels into India. Now, most interestingly, I'll just bring some more facts, which will be of interest to the audience and the people interested in counterterrorism. Salafi Philanthropic Society also has ties with RAF. That's another Qatar charity which has a strong relationship with the Al Qaeda affiliates like Jabhat al-Nusra and Muslim Brotherhood Surah. And then Dr. Hussain Madhur, he is heading the Kerala Philanthropic Society, and Dr. Hussain Madhur is also the head of Kerala Nadwatul Mujahideen, which is the largest Salafi group of Kerala. And in the past, many people with ISIS, who later on joined ISIS, they were found to have previous links with this organization. Though in public domain, the organization claims to be a progressive organization, but it has been found in various incidents that they disseminate very radical and extremist content. So this gentleman, Dr. Hussain Madwadu, he in a Facebook video message openly praised Mr. M.M. Akbar. And Mr. M.M. Akbar is known as the Zakir Naik of Kerala. And we all know who Mr. Zakir Naik is. Mr. Zakir Naik was the head of the Peace Education Foundation, and he allegedly inspired the ISIS attackers in Bangladesh. And after that, since then, he has been absconding from India, and he was always preaching very radical extremist content. Now, many employees of the Peace Education Foundation, of which Mr. M.M. Akbar was the head, they were found to have ties with the ISIS. In fact, the main coordinator of ISKP in Kerala, Abdul Rashid Abdullah, he was once the employee of Peace Foundation. And Mr. M.M. Akbar allegedly, as told by Abdul Rashid Abdullah, he tried to protect the identity of 2 of the employees of the Peace Foundation because they had traveled to Afghanistan to join ISIS-K. So, I just want to highlight how these organizations in Kerala, which received this biggest grant from the each charity, they have very strong ties with the ISIS affiliates or the people who were joining ISIS. Okay, and in their schools they were already teaching very extremist content. Secondly, another large cachet went to the Symposium Educational Charitable Society, which was nowhere to be found in the public domain. No online presence, nothing. But then we found that they were sending money to a very remote district in UP, that's the Siddharth Nagar district. And I mean, I would say superficially or in the public domain, most of the people would say that they were sending money to build mosques or some kind of welfare works, but they were funding money to Al Farouk, which is an organization with Salafi beliefs working in that area. And the organization was very active against the Barelvi and the Sufi Muslims, which is a liberal, I would say mildly liberal and a local strain of Islam, but at odds with the Wahhabi extremists. And they were trying to, I mean, involved in polarizing activities, communal activities. So, I mean, this is, I mean, I'll just address the other issues later when you ask more questions, but this is what I want to highlight, that
Sure.
some of these organizations they have very strong links with the people who joined ISIS or nurtured those kind of ideologies, and they are trying to reach out to the very small and remote parts of India.
Okay. Fascinating that it is so close to even ISIS. That's really shocking. Martha, you focused mostly on money going to European countries, and you detailed several instances similar, I suppose, to Abhinav, that gifts were going to mosques that had very close ties with ISIS, including one where an ISIS recruiter regularly preached prior to his arrest. Was it prevalent, do you think, that gifts were given in Europe to mosques that had ISIS recruiters? And do you think they had a goal in de facto of supporting ISIS in this way, or is this sort of a side effect?
So I think so Europe received only a small portion. So as Cliff mentioned, there was a total of 770 million just globally distributed. Europe got a small portion, but what's interesting in Europe is that I think mosques often struggle to find enough funding, such as in France. So I think that gives Qatar a huge influence when they were just giving as much money to these Islamic centers. And so, yeah, I think it's very interesting that in all these different countries in Europe that we looked at, mosque after mosque was directly tied to either ISIS or Al-Qaeda, this type of terrorist organization. So I think you mentioned there was one that had ISIS preacher who was there regularly. And at the time, the Swedish security service, because this one was in Sweden, said there was a clear picture of radicalization and recruitment at that mosque. And in another mosque also in Sweden, where the imam applauded ISIS for taking over the Iraqi city of Mosul. This was 2014, and even encouraged his followers to finance ISIS. So as for whether Qatar is directly supporting ISIS, I don't think that this gives us enough information to say, but I think it's undeniable that Qatar is clearly supporting extremism throughout Europe. And as we can see with these ties to ISIS and Al-Qaeda, that can directly lead to people being radicalized and eventually to terrorist attacks.
Fascinating. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll go to audience questions. So if any of the audience would like to ask a question, go into the Q&A section, and you can type in a question that can hopefully be asked on the air. In the meantime, I've got one more. Also, Martha, you noticed in your article, up until 2014, Saudi Arabia was pumping a lot of money into foreign Islamic organizations, many of which were troubling, but that has been massively scaled back in the past 7 years or so. And Saudi Arabia further, as everybody knows now, considers organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood a threat rather than sort of a partner. And you mentioned in your article that Qatar has more or less seemed to take over where Saudi Arabia let off. And this goes to all of you, and you can all answer in anything you want to say. Do you think this has any wider implications about extremism funding, U.S. strategy, Indian or Middle Eastern strategy, and what is it? How should this fact be handled, and what does it mean, I suppose?
I'll just say that I think that because Saudi Arabia funded extremism for so long, I think that many lawmakers, or maybe not necessarily to say updated, and still maybe see Saudi as the main threat. But I think what these grants tell us is that Qatar has clearly replaced Saudi as the main funding source for Islamist extremism. And I think that future policies need to take that into account.
Certainly. The U.S. government has historically had a decent relationship with Qatar. Do any of you, and any of you can answer this, do you think that any of this kind of information is seeping into the US government? I mean, what I'm asking, do you think the United States has a, how should I put this? They have a way of addressing this. I think that's what's being asked. They have a method of addressing these kind of problems with Qatar, or are they just fully putting their head in the sand?
I would like to take this if that's possible. I think there's sufficient evidence to show that this is not a partisan problem. This is something across the whole political spectrum, and that American politicians and our government are actively engaging with Qatari leaders, whether that be in the Qatari Business Council, whether that be previous officials, secretaries of state in particular, and multiple administrations have recognized the strong role that Qatar plays. We trust Qatar to provide us with a military safe haven in the Al Udeid Air Base. We afford them so much opportunity to serve our country, but at the end of the day, it is my belief that Qatar is not a real ally as they continue to fund terrorist organizations and Islamist organizations throughout the region that threaten American security. And at the same time, they're also giving funding to American universities. And there is such a strong tie between Qatar and the United States today. And the fact that our country doesn't better realize the security threat that Qatar poses is concerning. And I think we need to remember that reportedly in the past, Qatar actually reportedly hosted Khalid Sheikh Mohammed between the years, if I recall correctly, 1993 and 1996. And it's rumored that Qatar might have actually even helped Khalid Sheikh Mohammed escape when the US was closing in, eventually escaping to Pakistan. And so we really need to reevaluate whether all of these benefits, lucrative benefits that Qatar affords the United States, is it worth it?
Yeah, so there's a related question that an audience member is asking, and that is from David Levine. We have an administration in Washington that willfully ignores or denies the dangers of radical Islam. Look at how they managed to turn the Texas synagogue attack into, I'm not sure what their motives were. How can we ever, through the most research, such as the speakers present, possibly translate into effective government action when our own government subverts such corrective action? So yeah, I guess what that's really asking is, what would be a step that Washington could take, does anybody think, that could sort of be effective policy it's trying to push back against this? I guess you could go answer that too, Jordan.
I have to be careful how I answer this and in which role. I would start off by just saying education is key. Educating our congressmen and our congresswomen and our senators about the dangers that the Qatari government poses, the funding that it provides to Hamas, the assistance it's provided to Muslim Brotherhood affiliates in Egypt, in Yemen, throughout North Africa and the Middle East. We need to start with that. I think that is ultimately what I can emphasize today. I'll let others, I guess, take away if they want to discuss further specific policies.
Anybody else?
Cliff, can I just take this question now?
Sure.
Though I'm not an expert on American issues and American affairs, but I seriously feel that, especially among the American political class, there seems to be a very acute lack of understanding, especially when it comes to these radical extremist ideologies. Okay. So I must say, it's not just about when we look at the funding, or when we look at some of these groups funding, or like even the government's funding. The most crucial aspect is the ideology which is working behind. I have worked in Jammu and Kashmir over the last 3-4 years, and 5 years, must say. And I have come across a very simple fact that some of the groups, which are working as a very legal entities, and they have tie-ups with the government, they have links with the government, but their core belief in a very extremist, in a very Salafi, Wahhabi strain of Islam, that is something which needs to be taken care of. And until and unless they continue to stick to that, so they are bound to get back to something which is very extremist, or something which is ultimately aiding and supporting these terror groups. whatever funding, whatever charity is coming through these religious groups or the charities working with some religious association or GAP, it is bound to, and it is, by default, it has to go into something which is either extremist or which is either related to terror groups. Because again, once again, the linkages go to the ideology. In a Salafi ideology, the Shias have no right to exist. If you talk, I have spoken to their clerics and all, they very seriously argue that the problem is that, I mean, if you go to the very rigid interpretation, not a rigid, a very, I would say, fundamentalist interpretation, non-Muslims, they will have to live like a dhimmi, and they will have to pay taxes to live as a citizens in a caliphate-controlled territory, or even the non-conformist Muslims, which includes the Barelvi or the Sufi Muslims of India, or the Shias or Ahmadiyas, they don't have a right to exist as Muslims. The problem is the ideology. So I guess, we need to educate the lawmakers that any organizations which may be existing as a completely welfare entity, but as long as they continue to stick to that ideology, there is a problem.
That actually leads to one other audience question I'll ask. Is Qatar's aim in these donations mainly advancing Qatar's or radical Islam's objectives? I guess I would say, I guess the better way to ask that, I would say, is, can you tell the difference between Qatar's interests and Qatar's ideology? Might be another way to putting that.
If I may quickly take this, I think it's important to understand the smoke machines that Qatar employs. They have an incredible airline that always wins awards, Qatar Airways, sponsoring sports, sponsoring media, sponsoring universities. Qatar portrays itself as this patron of arts, of the sports, of modernity. But at the end of the day, at the same time, it's still funding radical ideologies. And we have to reconcile the charity that Qatar is ultimately sponsoring versus the ideologies that are counterintuitive that they're also sponsoring. And when we understand these two together, we realize that often a lot of Qatar's charades are simply smoke machines designed to disguise what its true ideologies are, which are Islamist in nature.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question here. The US has a large air base in Qatar, which you guys have mentioned before, I believe you did, Jordan, and it needs to protect and might make it difficult to challenge Qatar in these issues. Is there anything that can be done, do you think, to change that dynamic? Jordan or anybody else?
I think we need to be very careful regarding who Qatar's allies are. At the end of the day, Qatar pretends to be an ally for the United States and an aid in helping mediate the situation regarding the Taliban in Afghanistan. But at the end of the day, it also offered safe haven to many of the Taliban's leaders. It's also been rumored that Qatar has supported the IRGC. And so we have to continue balancing the benefits of Qatar's incentives and understanding the security threats. And the security threats are very real.
All right, that's just about time for today. Thank you very much for all of you joining us.
Can I just make a point before we wrap up?
Real quick, we have to go in just a few seconds.
Yes. So actually, in my findings, I came across that most of the organizations who were getting funding in India, they were changing names. They were not existing in public domains. And the intelligence and investigative agencies, they either had a very poor track record of them, or they were simply not aware. So there's a very strong likelihood that some of these groups may route this money from India, taking advantage of the apathy of the intelligence agencies. And this money may end up in the US through some of these I would say, remote channels coming from India, because in US there's a much more rigorous investigation.
Understand. Anyhow, thank you very much for a fascinating webinar. We have to get on today, but thank you, Martha, Jordan, and Abhinav for coming on, and thanks for discussing this important issue. I'm sure we'll be hearing more about it in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.